Wainman. I am the Director of Student Life for the Frost Student Association. Co-hosting with me tonight is Adam Folland, the President of the Frost Student Association. And tonight, our final speaker event, we are joined by Joanna Hodge, the Program Coordinator for the Earth Resources Program at Fleming College, and a world explorer here to talk about her adventures in Antarctica, a geologist abroad, rocks and penguins. Please take it away.
Thanks very much, Dawson. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining me this evening. My name is Joanna Hodge, and I am the coordinator of the Earth Resources Technician Corps program here at the Frost campus. So this is a story of one of the life-changing that I've experienced, and I'm going to tell you why at the end of this presentation. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry. Tonight, what I'm going to do is take you on an icy journey to the end of the Earth. We're going to take a look at penguins, fur seals, icebergs, shipwrecks, and of course, my favorite topic, which is rocks. Although there are a lot of penguins in this, to be quite honest. So this is Antarctica. And when you think about Antarctica, if in fact you ever do, and it's possible that you don't, the name probably evokes an image of a wild and desolate place that is accessible only to the fortunate few. And you would be right. It's the coldest, driest, windiest, highest continent on Earth. Mean summer temperatures in the interior are around minus 30 degrees Celsius and about minus 10 on the coast. And in the winter, it's much, much colder, down to about minus 60. This map shows the annual average precipitation in millimeters liquid equivalent, which ranges from 0 in the center of the continent to about 600 millimeters. If we compare that to Canada, where average annual precipitation ranges from about 500 millimeters in arid areas to more than 2,000 millimeters in the mountains. So it's a pretty dry location. It's extremely windy. So this image shows wind speed in meters per second. And you can see the intensity here in the Southern Ocean, where wind speeds for the period indicated averaged about 60 kilometers per hour. So that's pretty strong wind. And it is isolated. It is both geographically and thermally on its own at the bottom of the world. So why go to Antarctica? Well, as a child, and this is me when I was about 5, I had a bucket list of places that I wanted to see. The Grand Canyon, the Great Wall of China, Aurora Borealis, Alaska, but Antarctica was top of my list. Now, growing up in New Zealand, in the grand scheme of things, Antarctica wasn't actually that far away. It was in the same hemisphere. Antarctic expeditions departed regularly from Christchurch. And although Christmas is a summer holiday spent at the beach in New Zealand, penguins featured quite heavily in Kiwi holiday iconography, generally wrapped up with red and white scarves that look like peppermint sticks. But for a little girl from a little town in Taranaki, for whom a drive to Auckland was a big adventure, Antarctica may as well have been in another galaxy. But, in the words of Lao Tzu, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So getting there is actually half the journey, and it took me a couple of days. At the time, I was living in Vancouver, and I left Vancouver for Los Angeles, and from there, the first step of the journey was a stopover in Santiago to await our next flight. So we had the opportunity to go and watch condors in the Andes at Farallones, which is about 30 kilometers out of the city, and it was pretty amazing. I mean, the Andes. I never thought I would make it to the Andes. There's a type of plagioclase named for the Andes and a volcanic rock. So it doesn't really get much more exciting. We had a pretty early night because we had an extremely extremely early morning flight to Punta Arenas, and then on to Stanley in the Falkland Islands, where we boarded the ship. So the Falkland Islands is a really interesting spot. It is a group of islands in the South Atlantic Ocean that is a British protectorate. So Falkland Islanders are British citizens. And it was the focus of a 10-week war between Argentina and the United Kingdom in 1982. I'm still not particularly clear why a war was fought over this tiny southern outpost, but I do remember it being on the news when I was a kid, watching one of the two available channels in New Zealand at the time. So it was a pretty cloudy day when we flew into Mount Pleasant Airport in the capital city of Stanley. But we later found out that our land Chile flight was escorted in by fighter aircraft, which is apparently pretty common practice when flying into the Falklands, because it is still a military base. So Stanley is where we boarded the ship on which we would head south to Antarctica. This is the academic IOFI, and it is a Russian research vessel that is chartered for polar expeditions. This is a geological map of our journey. So this star up the top here is the Falkland Islands, and that is where we departed from. So our first stop after an all-night sail was Sea Lion Island, which is a national nature reserve to the south of the Falklands. The expectations for the day were Magellanic, rockhopper, and gentoo penguins, as well as elephant seals and sea lions. So this is a group of participants on the trip on the beach just after we arrived, and this is a line of Magellanic penguins and chicks that are strolling back to the tussock. So this is a Magellanic penguin, and this was the first species of penguin that we saw. I think we actually got to see about 7 or 8 different species by the time I had finished the trip, but pretty cute and living in the tussock here. This is a chick. This is the Magellanic penguin chick, and they nest in holes in the tussock, so they were also pretty adorable. We also saw rockhopper penguins, and this is a particularly striking outcrop of sedimentary rock that they hung out on. And they actually lived in some kind of symbiotic relationship with imperial cormorants. So the cormorants are these black and white birds that have these yellow kind of blobs on the front of their beaks. The rockhopper penguins are quite distinctive. They have some pretty crazy eyebrows. You can see they look a little bit squinty, and they've got these very adorable eyebrows. And you can see this beautiful set of intersecting joints in the rocks behind them. We also saw gentoo penguins and king penguins. So that was 3 species of penguin on the first day of the trip. So penguins are a bit of a focus. Now, one of the truly amazing things about this trip is that the staff were scientists, historians, nature artists, and wildlife photographers. So the trip wasn't just a junket, it was educational. It was actually organized by the Geological Society of America to celebrate their 125th anniversary. So everybody on there had a background in geology or marine biology or climate science. It was pretty awesome. On our first day at sea, when we were heading from Stanley to South Georgia Island, we had a full day of lectures on things like glaciers and sea level rise, global climate change, birds, mammals, photography, and we also had art school. So one of the highlights of the day for me was drawing something that was a recognizable penguin in art class, although abandoning our lectures and racing up to the bridge to see hourglass dolphins, which you can see in this image, was also pretty neat. So day 3 at sea was New Year's Eve. We actually celebrated it at 9 p.m. so that the staff could get to sleep. But some of us stayed up to celebrate in the actual time zone that the ship was in. So it is probably the best and most spectacularly located New Year's Eve that I have ever spent. So day 4 was also at sea, and on day 4 we crossed the Antarctic convergence. So the Antarctic convergence coincides with the polar front, which is the boundary between warm and cold air that occurs around about 60 degrees latitude. It's marked by a drop in surface water temperature and a significant increase in marine productivity. And so we saw the abundance of seabirds and marine mammals significantly increase as we crossed the Antarctic convergence. Some of the things that we saw were fur seals, prions, petrels, and albatross. And this image is a black-browed albatross. They're very beautiful, and they kind of look like they have smoky eyeliner. We also had another lecture series on the geology of South Georgia, which is our destination for day 5. A very bloody description of whaling in the Southern Ocean and the history of the Grytviken whaling station on South Georgia Island, which we'll take a look at shortly. Day 4 was also our first sight of land for a couple of days as we passed shag rocks, which are guano-encrusted blips in the ocean that heralded our arrival at South Georgia Island. So we spent 5 days at South Georgia, and it is a truly fascinating location. It's kind of the holder of one of the greatest stories of human endurance, the story of Ernest Shackleton, which we'll take a look at shortly. It's also the site of wholesale slaughter of whales for 60 odd years at the end of the 20th century. And it is the home to fur seals, which are very little landmines. This is South Georgia Island. This is a picture taken from space, clearly not one of mine. It is also a British protectorate in the Southern Ocean, and it was also involved in the Falklands War. It was invaded by Argentina in 1982. But it is famous for reasons other than the Falklands War, and 2 of them, the story of Ernest Shackleton and the Endurance, and the story of whaling stations on South Georgia Island, are particularly compelling. So we're going to take a look at those 2 aspects of South Georgia Island. So the Endurance expedition was a polar excursion led by Sir Ernest Shackleton from 1914 to 1916, and historians consider that it marked the end of the heroic age of polar exploration. So this is Sir Ernest Shackleton. By the early 20th century, almost all of the feats of Antarctic polar exploration had been accomplished. Roald Amundsen had successfully reached the South Pole in December 1911, after Shackleton failed to do so in 1909. So Shackleton decided that he wanted to tackle a transcontinental march via the South Pole from Vassal Bay to the Ross Sea. So the story of this ultimately doomed expedition is considered one of the most epic feats of human endurance. Shackleton had already been south twice before, so he had a pretty good idea of the kind of men he was looking for. Women were absolutely not welcome, although some did apply, and they received a courteous but negative reply. He set up his recruiting office in New Burlington Street in London, and the men came. This advertisement in the picture reads, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return, doubtful. Honor and recognition in case of success." There's actually no historical documentation to prove that this advertisement ever existed, but it has kind of persisted in the popular culture that surrounds Ernest Shackleton's journey to the south. What is true is that over 5,000 people applied for a position on the excursion, and the promise of glory certainly came to fruition, although there was a mighty journey before that ever happened. So Shackleton and his crew of 28 men, 69 dogs, and equipment departed the Grytviken whaling station on South Georgia Island on December the 5th, 1914. Remember that this is the Southern Hemisphere summer, so his goal was to embark upon his crossing that season. Unfortunately, they became trapped in sea ice extremely quickly. This photograph here was taken by Frank Hurley, the ship's photographer, and he wrote, "All day we have been utilizing the ship as a battering ram. We admire our sturdy little ship, which seems to take a delight herself in combating our common enemy, shattering the floes in grand style. When the ship comes in impact with the ice, she stops, dead, shivering from truck to keelson, and then almost immediately a long crack starts from the bows into which we steam, and like a wedge, slowly force the crack sufficiently open to enable a passage to be made." Unfortunately, their luck ran out on January the 18th, when they became trapped in sea ice. So the ship, the Endurance, became trapped, and they had not yet reached their targeted landing spot. At this point, Shackleton was actually optimistic that they might become free and continue the expedition in the following Antarctic spring. Unfortunately, freedom was not to be, and the crew and the ship spent the next 6 months drifting with the pack ice until finally their ship, the Endurance, was crushed and sank in October 1915. At this point, the men set out on foot, dragging 3 lifeboats behind them filled with supplies, and in preparation for sailing to one of the several outposts stocked with food that might allow them to reach out for rescue. So you can see 2 of these lifeboats on the side of the Endurance in this image that was taken by Frank Hurley. This image shows the path that the Endurance and then the crew of the Endurance took before they were rescued. The orange dashed line here shows the path of the Endurance while it was trapped in pack ice. And in this kind of brownish dotted line here is the path that the crew trekked across pack ice, dragging their lifeboats. On April the 8th, 1916, the ice floe on which they were camped broke up, and the decision was made to launch the lifeboats. They ultimately decided to set out for Elephant Island, which was a rocky chunk of remote, uninhabitable land that was rarely visited by whalers or other ships. So this is Elephant Island. It is rocky, it is inhospitable, and nobody ever goes there. It is also an extremely rough ride. So this is what the Southern Ocean looks like in a ship. And recall that Shackleton and his crew crossed from the ice floe to Elephant Island in lifeboats using oars. So this is a photograph of one of their lifeboats. Elephant Island provided a temporary reprieve, but waiting for rescue was not a viable proposition. So Shackleton and 5 men set sail for South Georgia Island on the James Caird, which is one of the lifeboats, hoping to raise the alarm and rescue the remaining crew members. It took them 16 days, but eventually the crew of the James Caird landed at Peggotty Bluff on South Georgia Island on May the 10th. So this is Peggotty Bluff, and you can see that we landed in much more comfortable conditions in our Zodiacs. Unfortunately for the crew, the whaling stations lay on the northern coast of the island, and so they had to hike through the interior to the Stromness whaling station in winter, and over 100 years ago when the island's glaciers were far more extensive. So on May the 20th, the hiking party of 3 heard the steam whistle at the Stromness whaling station, and they descended to safety. So this is Stromness. It is not active anymore. But Shackleton managed to secure a ship, and he returned to Elephant Island, and he rescued the remaining crew. What is truly amazing about this is that nobody from Shackleton's crew died in the 18 months that they were stranded. So they were adrift on ice or camped on Elephant Island for a total of 18 months. And that is truly an incredible feat of endurance. So the ship was appropriately named. Now you can actually hike the Shackleton hike. This is me and my friend Nat at the top of the Shackleton hike near Crean Lake. This is Shackleton's waterfall. They had to descend this waterfall, but it was in winter and it was extremely icy. It was very, very difficult trek. Once you get to the bottom of the waterfall, there is about a 2-kilometer hike across the outwash plain to Stromness whaling station. But interestingly, geology guides the way. And so you can see this kind of Z-shaped fold in the sedimentary rocks behind the Stromness whaling station. And they saw that, and it gave them some guidance as to where they were. So this is the Stromness whaling station. It's abandoned now, and it is off limits. You can't get close to the buildings, but there is plenty of evidence of its past existence, and it certainly serves as a monument to both human endeavor and human waste. Ernest Shackleton died on January the 5th, 1922, and is buried on South Georgia Island at Grytviken. So I was there on the 91st anniversary of his death, and we raised a toast at his grave with a bottle of scotch. One of Shackleton's contemporaries, Sir Raymond Priestley, said, "For scientific method, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency, give me Amundsen. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton." The other reason that South Georgia Island is so well known or notorious, perhaps, is because it was the site of a number of whaling stations between 1904 and 1965, mostly Norwegian whaling stations. Whaling was a huge industry in the early to mid 20th century, and South Georgia Island was host to several of those whaling stations. This graph shows the number of each species of whales killed and processed at the South Georgia stations, either on land or shore-based floating factories. In 1910, there were over 6,000 humpback whales killed alone. And you can see the numbers of other species. So hundreds of thousands of whales that were slaughtered in the first half of the 20th century. You can see that there are a number of different species: blue whales, fin whales, humpback whales. An interesting note is that right whales, which were also hunted extensively, are so named because they float to the surface once they've been harpooned and are the right whales to catch. It's interpreted that by the end of the 1960s, the population of hunted whale species had declined by 98%. Whales were hunted for blubber, for meat, and baleen. The blubber was a source of fuel oil, and baleen was used in women's fashion, particularly for corsets. Interestingly, some scientists, including one biologist who was on the trip, consider that the increased use of fossil fuels actually saved whales from extinction because they were alternative sources to blubber. Of course, there are all sorts of issues with our overuse of fossil fuels, but without them, we likely wouldn't have any whales left. So evidence for whaling is littered across South Georgia. This is Grytviken, which is a British outpost. There is a scientific station there, and every summer, British scientists come and live at Grytviken. This is the academic Ioffe in the background of the harbour. This is the petrel. You can see the harpoon on her bow, which is also at Grytviken. This is Stromness, which is pretty much out of bounds to all but the penguins now. But we see relics of whaling all over the island. And so these are whale vertebrae at Stromness, with some particularly cute and extremely vicious fur seals lounging on the bones. Now, one of the highlights of South Georgia Island is that it is absolutely full of wildlife. These are king penguin chicks. They're covered in brown fuzz and they look like kiwi fruit on legs. They're sometimes referred to as oakum boys, which is the name for prisoners and children who prepared tarry fibers that were used to caulk joints in wooden ships. So those oakum boys, the children and the prisoners, were often covered in the brown fuzz from working on in those fibers. And these king penguin chicks kind of look like that too. They're pretty cute. These are king penguins. They look pretty stylish in their tuxedos, and they are actually surprisingly clean. Penguins are pretty filthy and stinky, even though they're very, very cute. These are penguins and seals frolicking away in a proglacial stream. There is a glacier in the background here that is melting. You can see some young penguins here in the foreground that look like they're partly fluffy. So they're molting, and once the fuzz is gone, they will have their adult feathers and they'll be able to swim. So young fuzzy penguins can't swim. They don't have waterproof feathers. They are completely reliant on their parents until they molt. This is called catastrophic molting. And when they get their adult feathers, they can go out and hunt for themselves. This is the penguin colony on South Georgia Island at Gold Harbour. We had to climb a ridge to get to the colony, and we could hear and smell the penguins before we got there. So there were penguins pretty much as far as the eye could see, about 50,000 of them. You can see the oakum boys here in the front, and then penguins just stretching off as far as you can see in the distance. It's kind of like a Where's Wally puzzle. We also saw some macaroni penguins. So these are pretty fancy penguins with dandy eyebrows, and are splashing away on the rocks here with a gentoo watching on in the background. And the same location with, penguins as far as the eye can see. And we've got some macaronis, we've got some gentoos, and we've got some king penguins. Penguins, of course, are awesome. It was International Penguin Day on Sunday. But there are all sorts of other animals on South Georgia Island, including many species of birds. So these are Antarctic terns sitting on a nice schist that has been cross-cut by some quartz veins. This is a nesting skua. Skuas predate on penguin chicks. They're pretty vicious creatures. This is a skua chick. This is a light-mantled city albatross. So we saw a number of different species of albatross. And then there are the ubiquitous fur seals. So this is a leucistic fur seal, which means that it's pale-colored. Most of them are a darker brown color. It certainly looks super cute. It is adorable. But these things are furry little landmines. Their mothers are very, very protective, and God help you if you get between a fur seal and her cub. The last thing you want to do is get nipped by a fur seal. These are elephant seals, and they are extremely common. They're named for their long, wobbly, elephant-like noses, but these are pups, so they haven't developed their noses. And then in the foreground here, there's a sleeping fur seal. Again, the elephant seals are pretty adorable, but they are smelly, farting, wallowing creatures. They pile together and they launch themselves onto the top of the pile, which wobbles like a waterbed, and they steam because the air is cold and these big piles of blubbery seals are extremely warm. But, I mean, look at that face. That's pretty freaking cute, don't you think? So the landscapes are also diverse. This is Drygalski Fjord, which is an ice scape of mountains and sea ice and glaciers. More glaciers, glaciers and rocks. And this is a stack of ophiolite rocks overlooking Larsen Harbor. So this is me in the pink hat and my friend Matt. Ophiolites are extremely interesting. They are chunks of oceanic crust that have scraped off of a subducting slab and they end up on land. They're quite rare. I mean, usually oceanic crust gets subducted into the mantle and recycled in volcanic arcs. So Larsen Harbor was a really great place to see them. And so what we're looking at here is seafloor basalt that has been extensively altered. This green mineral is a mineral called epidote. And again, you know, this epidote altered seafloor. This is Reindeer Valley, which again is a pretty unique environment. It provides an interesting contrast between the arid, almost desert-like environment and the tabular icebergs and the bergy bits in the background. So this was part of a hike that we took across the Bath Peninsula. And we were descending down into Reindeer Valley to meet up with our ship, which was not in the picture at this stage. So what you don't see in the image is that this whole plain here was covered in extremely territorial fur seals that we had to navigate to get to the ship. This is the view as we sailed away from South Georgia Island. So again, pretty amazing, wide open spaces, large tabular icebergs, and mountains. So from South Georgia Island, we headed across the Drake Passage, which is some of the roughest ocean in the world. It was a bit of a vomit-inducing trip for some people, but the rewards were pretty spectacular. So if we take a look at this map again, this is South Georgia Island, and we headed in this direction out to Elephant Island. So we headed south and west. We were at sea for about 3 days before we arrived at Elephant Island. Gravity driven, and they move down slope from upper cold elevations down to the sea. They're extremely strong, and you can see this. You can see them in this image reflected in the clouds that appear to be flowing down the hill. This is Point Wild on Elephant Island, where Frank Wild and 21 other men from Shackleton's Endurance spent 4 months awaiting rescue. So this is where they lived. They camped on a narrow shingle spit to the left of this central chunk of ice here at the base of a glacier. So not an overly pleasant place to live. There is a memorial marking the location on the beach. You can just see it down here to the left of that big chunk of rock. I'm not a huge fan of camping at the best of times, but can you imagine living here in a shelter made from an upturned lifeboat, eating penguins and seals? Underwhelming at this location. It was not particularly blue and not overly schisty, but the penguins were adorable. So this is a chinstrap penguin. So I think we're on to species number 5 now of the penguins. And you know, here is one leaping from one rock to another. Also some gentoo penguins. These are chicks. You can see that they're pretty filthy. Penguins are generally not overly clean. And of course, the little fluffies can't go swimming yet. So, so they're pretty poop encrusted. And they're also clearly exhausted. So this is a chick that is sleeping on the rock. Pretty cute. So this is how we got from the ship to the shore by Zodiac. So one of the great things about traveling by Zodiac is that we had lots of opportunity to get up close and personal with the rocks and the wildlife. So this is a picture that I took of a couple of the other Zodiacs from the one that I was in. We got pretty good at protecting our cameras and making sure that we didn't drop them in the ocean because that would have been very unfortunate. We were lucky on one afternoon to be treated to a show by a humpback whale and her calf as we made it back to the ship. So late afternoon, heading back to the academic IOFI, and you can see that there is a humpback whale in the foreground here. So from Elephant Island, we continued south to Hope Bay and we visited Esperanza Station. So on our way to Esperanza, we encountered a lot of pack ice. It was pretty thick and it was pretty neat. I was standing up the front of the ship on the bow, just watching the ice move past the ship. It was pretty cool. There were also some extremely spectacular icebergs. So this is just another picture of pack ice on our approach to Hope Bay. And in the background here, these red buildings is Esperanza Station, which is an Argentine base. So the history of various nations' claims to Antarctica is pretty fascinating. Everybody is looking for a slice of the pie. And Esperanza Station is just one of the many bases scattered throughout the Antarctic. So various countries have laid claim to small slices of Antarctica. Britain has claimed sovereignty by establishing the first post office, and we'll take a look at that post office shortly. But Argentina laid claim by having its first citizen born in Antarctica here at Hope Bay. So that's a clear distinction between Argentinians and Brits, for sure. So this is me at Hope Bay with the academic IOFI in the background. Species number 6 at Hope Bay. This is a colony of Adelie penguins. They have pretty distinctive black faces and they have white eyeliner that makes them look permanently startled. These are chicks. You can see it was snowing that day. and they are sitting on a guano-encrusted outcrop. So penguins are pretty talented. They can projectile poop. You don't want to be in the way of that when it happens. And the reason that it's pink is because they have a heavy diet of krill, which is a type of shrimp. Now, as we got further south, we noticed that the chicks were getting younger the further south we traveled. So they hatch much later in the season than their northern counterparts. Certainly, the difficulty of life in the wild was brought home by this Weddell seal, which has a jaw injury, probably from an encounter with other wildlife. So things are pretty raw and brutal in Antarctica. So from Hope Bay, we headed west to Deception Island, which is a volcano that last erupted in the 1960s. It's a caldera, and its donut shape is the result of highly explosive eruptions, which blew out the center of the volcano. So we initially landed at a place called Pendulum Cove, which is the site of a former scientific station. And so it was destroyed by the 1960s eruption. So this image shows me sitting on the wreckage of the scientific station, which was destroyed in that 1960s eruption. Now again, Deception Island was the site of a whaling station, and there were relics of that industry scattered all across the beach. In the afternoon, we relocated the ship to Whalers Bay, which is near Neptune's Bellows, and that's the narrow entrance to the caldera. This is a view looking back towards the entrance of the harbor. So this is Neptune's Bellows. We sailed through there, and it's a pretty tight squeeze. You certainly don't want to make sure that you get grounded on your way in. But this picture I took on my way to the chinstrap penguin colony at Bailey Head. So it was a difficult hike, partly because all of this material is loose pyroclastic rubble, but it was also extremely windy. We had very high winds at the top of the climb, 83 kilometers an hour. So it was pretty chilly, and it was quite difficult to walk against that. This is the view from the Bailey Head penguin colony out towards a series of steps called the swing machine needles. It was a little bit vertiginous. Certainly we were pretty high, we were pretty windy. Didn't want to get too close to the edge here. And then once we got back to the beach, we raced in for a dip in the ocean. So the water temperature was about 2 degrees Celsius, so barely above freezing. And it was a pretty brutal assault after hiking up to Bailey Head. Now you can see in this image here that the black sand beach, which is pretty common in volcanic environments, is steaming. And if you dig into the sand, you'll come across warm water. It's an active volcano, so there are geothermal springs. And we thought that we'd be digging holes in the sand and soaking our poor aching bodies after our hike to the top of the penguin colony. Unfortunately, there are fragile mosses that grow in the sand, and so we weren't allowed to dig. So we took a 30-second run into the ocean, just to say that we've swum in the Southern Ocean, and then came back out and had to try and struggle back into our sweaty clothes. It was impossible to get back into those clothes without getting the black volcanic sand in unmentionable places. So there was an awful lot of chafing on the Zodiac ride back to the ship. But we did have a hot tub and a sauna on the ship. So most of us availed ourselves of that opportunity to try and warm up after this extremely icy swim. We continued to head south again, still looking at the Antarctic Peninsula and islands, and headed to Cuvieville Island. So you can see here that the babies are extremely young. Some of these chicks were freshly hatched, and some of the penguins were still on eggs. These are Gentoo penguins, and these chicks were tiny, tiny. We crossed the Gerlache Strait, and in this picture, what you see is orcas in the front harassing humpback whales. And so we ended up staying there for a couple of hours watching the orcas hunt the humpbacks. It was pretty fascinating. And again, you know, wild, wild country. This is the furthest south point that we traveled. This is Charcot Point. And this photograph was taken at about midnight. Because we were so far south and it was midsummer, there was no sunset. So this was a pretty spectacular location. And one of the really neat things that I saw there is a leopard seal. So this is the academic Iophi in the background. This is a leopard seal giving me the stink eye. I had a pretty good zoom lens on my camera, so I wasn't anywhere near as close as what it looks. These things are vicious, and they will leap out of the water and attack you. So that was something that Shackleton had to deal with when they were floating in the pack ice. They had to avoid being eaten by leopard seals. So Charcot Point was the furthest south we went. We had to head north again. And we stopped at Point Lockroy, which is a British Antarctic base. So, you know, there is a joke amongst Antarctic workers that the Argentines had babies born in Antarctica to establish sovereignty, and the Brits established a post office. Our last stop here was Cuvieville Island, and again, you can see some Gentoos and chicks. So this was the excursion from Cuvieville Island. We headed back across the Drake Passage to Ushuaia at the bottom of Argentina to fly home. These are the participants and the staff on the excursion, many of whom I still keep in touch with. So I am standing in this picture wearing a pink and white pom-pom hat just behind the man who is wearing the keffiyeh. And the woman to the right of me in the photograph wearing a pink and purple hat was my roommate. So she was 84. And I aspire to be like her when I'm 80. She hiked the Shackleton Trail, and she was up for every single adventure. So at the beginning, I said that this trip was a life-changing trip. And why is that? Well, almost everybody in this picture and on the trip is a scientist of some description. And many were willing to share their experiences as researchers and professors and teachers. And it's because of the people that I met in Antarctica on this trip that I decided to give up mineral exploration and pursue a career in education. So that first step led me to where I am now, sharing my experiences with you. So it's been a long journey, from a little girl in a small town, New Zealand, to a college professor in small town, Canada, but one that has been well worth the effort. And so I would say to you that when you are faced with the opportunity to jump into the unknown, my advice to you would be just do it, because you never know what might happen.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. You got me very excited for a career-long adventure, for sure. It was a very great way to end off the series.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Dawson. Does anybody have any questions? Thanks, Christine.
Yeah, I have a question. So you know, we sort of talked about you being a world traveler and everything. Is Antarctica probably like your top spot that you've gone to?
Oh, for sure. You know, it's such a like it's such a privilege to be able to go there. It's not readily accessible. It's expensive to get to. I was very fortunate that I was working in mineral exploration, and you know, it 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 funded my travel to Antarctica. Um, I would love to go back. It's not easy to get there, and it takes a lot of time. So I think from the time I left Vancouver to the time I got back, it was almost a month. It's pretty difficult for people to take that kind of time off of work. So I was very fortunate. But yeah, Antarctica is definitely top of my list of places that I've been, and I would probably sell my soul to the devil to get back there again one day. It was pretty amazing.
Noah asked if you were able to bring home any rock samples with you, or even, and to add on to that, were you able to bring anything home with you from Antarctica?
Yeah, we were not allowed to take samples. Most of the time when we were on land, we were not even allowed to take food with us. So because the wildlife particularly is so fragile. Um, so often we would sort of have a half day, and then we would come back to the ship for lunch, and then we would go out again. So we did not get to collect any rocks. I did manage to purchase some souvenirs at Port Lockroy because it's a post office and a museum. So I sent a few postcards to my nieces from Antarctica, but this was not a trip that I took my rock hammer on. So it's basically a leave no trace experience.
So how old were you, and what level of education were you at when you got to go on this?
Oh, well, that'll reveal how old I am now. Um, this was it was in 2012, 2013. So I was 40. Um, I had uh, I had finished my PhD at the time, but it was a vacation, so it was not something that I had to have any experience for. I just had to pay the money. So there were people on the trip who were quite young, and there were people on the trip who were quite elderly, and then there was everybody in between. Um, so
So it wasn't just people doing research; it was people that were part of the Geologic Society that were invited to go.
oh, you cut out there.
Sorry, so it wasn't just researchers and stuff. It was just a variety of people from the Geologic Society. Are you there?
Uh, yeah, so there were, there were, yes, I'm here. Sorry, I've got some internet issues on my end, it looks like. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Um, yeah, so it wasn't a research excursion. It was it was a vacation that was run by the Geological Society of America. So I didn't have to have particular qualifications to go on it. I just had to pay. Um, but certainly there are researchers that go down to Antarctica and do research on all sorts of things. And that would have been ideal. It would have been nice to have gotten paid to go down there, but
And so you talked a bunch about, you know, all of the incredible experiences you got to see, and we see a lot of those in the pictures. What was probably the worst experience of being down there for you or anybody else on the crew?
I think the worst part of it was probably seasickness. I was pretty fortunate. I didn't really experience too much of that. Some people were pretty ill, and a couple of those at sea days were extremely rough. I've got some pretty awesome video of crossing the Drake Passage that I took from the bridge, but I didn't think that it would show up particularly well in the WebEx, so I didn't put it in. But you know, it was really difficult to say that there were any worst experiences. Everything was pretty amazing. I was super impressed with how well we were fed, actually. It's pretty amazing to be able to stock a ship for a month and you know, still give people salad and scrambled eggs on day 28. So I think probably aside from the seasickness, there really weren't any bad experiences. It was pretty amazing.
A far cry from Shackleton's experience, I'm sure.
Oh my gosh. I honestly, you know, I read there's a really great book called I think it's just called Endurance, Shackleton's story. And
Joanna, are you there?
yeah, I am. Sorry, we've just got an electrical storm going over here and I think it's affecting my internet.
Yeah, that's all right. Well, we could probably ask you tons of questions about the rest of your um, about the rest of your trip. But can we just close off? So, what did you have to say? We lost you right before you were talking about the book. Could you talk about the book, and then we'll close off for the night? I think we're losing her. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming out and checking out all of our Occ Talks for this entire semester. It's been a fun, informative experience. You can check out all of the old recorded Occ Talks on the FSA YouTube, and I encourage you to go and do so because we've had lots of incredible experiences from a bunch of incredible different professors. Thank you everybody, and have good luck with exams for the rest of this week.